Welcome to our author chat. Arno Zimmer was born in Rochester, New York, and grew up in several towns in upstate New York. He attended the University of Connecticut, from which he graduated cum laude with distinction in English. Subsequently, he received a master's degree in literature from Georgetown University, where he wrote his thesis on John Milton's Paradise Lost. He's the author of several novels, including his Parlor City Murder Mystery Trilogy and Death Comes to the Torpedo Factory. So we welcome Arno Zimmer.
Christina, thank you very much for that introduction. It's just great to be here today. This is my inaugural book reading, so if you notice some trepidation on my part, I think it'll pass after a while, but I hope you'll bear with me. I want to also provide a special thanks, which Christina, I know you'll pass on to Jenna Anthony for setting up the original author reading, which was going to be in person at the James Blackstone Memorial Library in Branford, Connecticut. And if you're ever in the Branford, Connecticut area, and some of you might live in that area, you know what I'm going to say probably next. It is a most magnificent facility. It's just a beautiful, it's like going to a museum there as far as I'm concerned. The staff is great, the facility is great, and if you're in the Branford area or at the Thimble Islands, which we'll get to next, I think you'll find it a very worthwhile excursion over to the library. When I was getting ready for this first public reading, I actually thought about Charles Dickens. Not that I would compare myself with Charles Dickens, but I remembered in reading about him that he did a lot of public readings, not just in England, but he actually came to the United States more than once. And he made an enormous amount of money when he did his public readings. He was a very popular man, and he was a very theatrical man. A lot of people don't know that he actually staged plays in London, and he did it often with one of his best friends, a novelist by the name of Wilkie Collins. Some of you may know Wilkie Collins. He was another great English writer, probably most famous for The Woman in White and The Moonstone. The Moonstone is kind of dear to my heart because it is considered by a lot of critics as not only the first detective novel in the English language, but possibly the best. Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens liked to carouse together, and when they got in trouble, Dickens' wife always blamed Wilkie Collins. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? But as confident as Charles Dickens seemed to be at all times, he made a comment to Wilkie Collins once, what I thought was pretty striking and made me feel a little bit better. He said that once while reading from Oliver Twist, he almost fainted. I don't think I'm going to faint today, but it didn't make me feel like I was in good company. What I'd like to do next is sort of expand upon the biography that Christina provided at the start. And the reason is that I want to kind of give you a sense of how my life affected the novels that I wrote. After being born in a small town that's actually part of Rochester, New York, by the name of Irondequoit, which is right on Lake Ontario, I spent my adolescent years in the southern tier of New York in a city known as Binghamton, which is right near the Pennsylvania border. Now, back in around 1900, like a lot of small towns and cities, Binghamton was very prosperous. In fact, at the turn of the century, the last century that is, there were over 100 cigar factories throughout the Binghamton area. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Binghamton was the second largest producer of cigars in the entire United States at that time. As a result, it was very prosperous in the Binghamton area, and Binghamton got the nickname the Parlor City. That's where I came up with the name for my Parlor City Murder Mystery Trilogy. Now, I spent my adolescent years in Binghamton, and around the age of 10 years old, my brother and I found a gun in a park. We like to make up stories now about what we did with that gun, but we didn't do much at all. We took it home. We might have hid it for a little bit, and then we gave it to our mother, and she turned it over to the police. But that incident stuck with me all of my life, and I swore at one point when I was younger that I was going to write a novel, and I was going to start that novel with that gun in the park. And in The Parlor City Boys, my first novel, a 10-year-old boy finds a gun in the park, but he doesn't bring it home to his mother. he hides it in the hollow of a tree, covers it with leaves, and then goes off to find his best friend to tell him about what happened. Well, they come back that night with a flashlight, and guess what? The gun is gone. And hence the Parlor City Boys turns into mayhem and mystery for the next couple hundred pages. So that's how the Parlor City Boys, the first novel in the trilogy, came about. After that came Return to Parlor City and A Murder in Parlor Harbor. Now, after high school, after Binghamton, my family moved to Syracuse, and I went to high school there, and my best friend decided he wanted to go to Middlebury College. So we took off in one of his family cars. We visited Middlebury, and for whatever reason, I can't remember now, we came down through Connecticut, and we stopped at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. And I fell in love with the school and said, this is where I want to go to college. I majored in English literature, as you heard, and in my junior year, I took a course in creative writing. And one of the assignments was to write a short story and mimic the style of Edgar Allan Poe. I did that. I got a pretty good grade. I still have the short story. I had to hold on to that over all these years. And I never forgot about it. And what I did is I wove that story of Edgar Allan Poe into The Severed Finger, A Thimble Island Mystery. And you'll hear about that as we go on today. After college, I ended up in Washington, D.C., and I eventually moved to a small town called Old Town, which is part of the city of Alexandria, right on the Potomac River. You can look across the water and see the Capitol, and you can see the monuments, and it was a great place to be. I was about 6 blocks from the water, and on the water at that time was an abandoned government building. In fact, it was a large complex, and it was known as the Torpedo Factory. And it had a long history going back to World War I. And I would walk by that abandoned factory all the time, and it stuck with me. And I finally used that incident to write the novel Death Comes to the Torpedo Factory. Incidentally, today the Torpedo Factory has been turned into an art colony. The city of Alexandria finally bought that abandoned facility, and it's a tourist attraction for people far and wide today. Around the late 80s, kind of finish up with a biography here, I moved back to Connecticut. And around the year 2000, I had the chance to be up in the Stony Creek area, which is, if you live in that area, know it's right next to the Thimble Islands. And it stuck in my mind there. I'd heard stories about Captain Kidd and buried treasure and that kind of thing, but I didn't do anything with it. But I went back around 2015. I went to the Stony Creek Museum, which is a great facility, by the way. If you go to the library, go to the museum, 2 nice stops in the Stony Creek area. And I started to write in earnest, and I decided that I was going to set my next novel around the Thimble Islands. And hence came The Severed Finger, A Thimble Islands Mystery. So I hope that gives you an idea as an author. And I wasn't ever convinced about this until I started writing. We always draw on those experiences we had, those memories that we store up, and somehow they come back at a certain time, and we start to use those to write a novel, and that's exactly what I did. So with that in mind, I want to now turn to the novel itself. We're going to do a couple of readings today. The bulk of the novel is going to take place in the Thimble Islands and New Haven, Connecticut. Now, most of the other places in here are going to be fictitious. If you know anything about history, you might recognize some of the places. I have what I call a reluctant hero. His name is Jerry Kaczynski. He actually appears in some of the earlier novels, but now he really is the featured person in this novel. And he's not an anti-hero. He's not a hero. He's very reluctant. There's nothing dark or demonic about Jerry Kaczynski. But I can tell you, you will meet some dark and demonic characters in The Severed Finger. He's just not one of them. So, Christina, I don't know if we want to stop to see if there's any questions about my background before we get into the readings, but I thought that would be helpful to the audience to kind of understand how I got to the point I am now and how I wrote The Severed Finger.
Sure, yeah. So anybody can type in the chat box. If you see it, it should be on the bottom of your screen. You might have to click more to get to the chat box, but you're welcome to to type your message, it says. So type your questions in there if you have any.
I'll take a quick drink of water while that is being done.
So
Gina, shall we move on?
someone asked one question I see. I think it's about the book more. It says, how did you pick a character with a Polish last name?
Just because it's my heritage too. I was curious.
Well, thank you. Now you're getting into my genealogy. But I do have some Polish in my background, Irish, Scottish, English, some French, and also some Polish. But I knew someone with a name similar to that when I was growing up, and I would tend to pick character names either out of historical novels. Some of you might pick up a name that you've read a novel by either Trollope or Dickens or Thackeray, and you'll see that I picked up a name to use as a character. But this was a name just came from my childhood.
Okay, there's a big Polish-American studies program in Central Connecticut State in New Britain, so I was just curious.
Well, I'm hoping all those Kaczynskis up there will buy the severed finger then.
Good, okay.
Well, thank you.
There is another question. It just says, is Jerry you as a young man?
Pardon me?
The question says, is Jerry you as a young man?
No, he's not, but I have to tell you that I had a very dear friend of mine that I hadn't seen for 50 years, and we met in New York earlier this year. We had just lost touch with each other. We played Little League together in Binghamton, New York, and we hung around a lot. And I never forgot him. He was bigger than me. He was smarter than me. And I looked up to him in terms of his intellect. He might have looked up to me because of my athletics, I'm not sure. We were kind of an odd couple as two young guys. And I pulled some of the characteristics I remember from him to mold into the character of Jerry Kaczynski. This friend, by the way, did read the novel and some prior novels of mine, and he knew that he was in there. But I never take a character exactly. I try to take an amalgamation of different characteristics from different people that I meet and mold them into a new character.
Perfect. Thank you. That's all I see for now.
Okay. So we're going to start off. By the way, I think I might have mentioned the bulk of the severed finger takes place in the year 1977. So you think it's 1977. There's no smartphones. Okay. You're not running to Blockbuster to get a cassette. A lot of things that we take for granted today, you just didn't have. So, you know, when someone stops at a telephone booth, that's because that's what you did back then to make a phone call. So we're going to start back in 1967. And the first 4 or 5 chapters of the novel cover the period 1967 to 1977. And then we're kind of in a rush to get to the Thimble Islands, which I hope you'll see why. But I want to go back and set the stage for our reluctant hero to get from where he is, which happens to be Parlor City, of all places, and get him to Thimble Islands. So it takes him 10 years to get there. So, Jerry Kaczynski has just graduated from Pythian College. You won't find that anyplace, by the way. Pythia was the oracle of Delphi in Greek mythology. She actually was the high priestess in the temple, and her job was to pass on messages from the god Apollo to the people. So that's Pythian College. So Jerry is about to set out on his journey of self-discovery. And by the way, I want to stop right there. In terms of novels of self-discovery, I think about, and I meant to mention this earlier, the what we call the picaresque novels that started in the 18th century. Heroes going off on a trip and finding themselves and finding their role in life. If you know anything about 18th century novels, you've got Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. You've got the Tobias Smollett novels like Peregrine Pickle. Peregrine is from the Latin word peregrination, which means to travel. If you move fast forward to the 20th century, in America you had Jack Kerouac, On the Road. And then you've got one of my favorites by Saul Bellow, The Adventures of Augie March. So my character is on the road to discovery. And now you're going to meet Jerry Kaczynski. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and over 220 pounds, Jerry Kaczynski might have been intimidating if not for his gentle nature and soft demeanor. He had double-jointed knees and occasionally walked with an exaggerated, awkward stride that made him look almost comical, a Don Quixote-type character in style and gait, which belied his sharp, inquisitive intellect. He was reticent about imposing himself on others, but was not shy about expressing himself when the occasion allowed or demanded. His thick, dark brown hair hung carelessly down his forehead to the top of his tortoise-shell glasses. You notice how I got myself into the novel? He had that puffy, pinkish skin that made his face look almost childlike. The full-blown mustache that draped over and dominated his upper lip saved him from this puerile ignominy. Jerry was being tired of being told through all those years at Pythian College that he was the spitting image of Mickey Dolenz of the rock group called the Monkees. He didn't even like their music. The mustache seemed to silence those who teased him about his twin brother, and in a way it marked his passage into adulthood. When he left Pythian, he was determined to be taken seriously. During that tumultuous summer in 1967 in Parlor Harbor, after graduation from Pythian College, Jerry had stayed in constant touch with Professor Eismore. This respected scholar of antiquities had high hopes for Jerry Kaczynski and could not accept the possibility that his prized pupil, his budding savant, would end up dead in some distant rice field, a sacrifice to the war gods, as he put it. Eismore had resources and contacts at schools around the world. He pledged to underwrite Jerry's exodus and, framing it as his civic duty, convinced Jerry to decamp to Toronto, where there was a thriving expat community. Once there, Jerry was to await further instructions from his Svengali. So there's your introduction to our reluctant hero, Jerry Kaczynski. So keep in mind, we've got that period from 67 to 77, and where does Jerry Kaczynski end up? You're going to find out now. A place called Freak Street, which actually existed. Freak Street in Kathmandu was the name given to this narrow thoroughfare by locals when wild-eyed, long-haired young Americans and Europeans started flooding into the ancient city in the 1960s. Before long, it became a geographical icon, much like Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and Greenwich Village in New York City. The hordes of aliens came for a variety of reasons, principal among them the best and cheapest cannabis, hashish, or marijuana on Earth. There was an overland route that became known as the Hippie Trail, beginning in London and eventually winding through Afghanistan and India before arriving in Nepal. Adventurous trekkers went on foot via what became known as the Annapurna Circuit, an often treacherous passage through the Himalayas. The less adventurous travelers boarded the charter buses that left London and Amsterdam on a regular basis, and for about $150 would deposit you in Kathmandu. Flower power was the rage, and hippies, successors to the beatniks of the 50s, were considered to have put Nepal on the tourist map for the young disenchanted. It wasn't long before nicknames for Kathmandu abounded. The Mecca of hippiedom, the New Jerusalem, the Amsterdam of the East, the capital of the Aquarian Age. Whatever you call it, Nepal was the happy land in the Orient, the mythical Shangri-La so many disaffected youth were so desperately seeking. Get a sense of partly why Jerry Kaczynski was driven to leave Parlor City and ends up in Kathmandu. So, That's the background. It really takes place in the first 4 or 5 chapters of the novel. It's now 1977. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. We can't read the entire novel today. But in 1977, Jerry Kaczynski is in, of all places, back in Parlor City, and he's getting antsy. His 10-year odyssey through Europe and Asia, he's now disillusioned and he's weak in spirit. Along the way, he makes a rash promise. Someone's father is missing in a place called the Thimble Islands. This individual can't go there to look for his father, and he implores Jerry to do it for him. Now 31 years old, he sets out again, but this time with no grandiose purpose and devoid of confidence. So our reluctant hero is on the road again. Eschewing the main highway, Jerry drove east on country roads through a small series of New York towns, many of which memorialize the state's heritage and its early citizens. He recalls 7th grade New York history class as he passed through Pompeii, named after the Roman general and statesman. He stopped in Nelson for coffee and learned that it had been named after the famous English admiral, Lord Nelson, who died at the Battle of Trafalgar during the Napoleonic Wars. After leaving Nelson, Jerry decided he would be in no hurry as he meandered over the forgotten roads that were the backbone of the colonies, the main thoroughfares during a time that was so vital to the establishment of the eventual Union. His next stop was West Winfield, named after General Winfield Scott, a hero of the War of 1812, and later Commander-in-Chief of the Army. In 1852, he was the Whig candidate for president, losing to Franklin Pierce. I kind of wish that Winfield Scott had won, actually. But today, who could name this brave man, and who would reverence his exploits, Jerry wondered. And if Winfield Scott was long forgotten, except for scholars, historians, and a few locals, what did that foretell for him? He made a pit stop in the village of Esperance, long enough to learn that in 1818 it was named for the French word meaning hope. He imagined that the settlers needed a large dose of it back then, and for some reason it spurred him on. He goes on his trip through upstate New York, and we'll skip ahead a little bit. The next day, Jerry arrived at Port Kent, a hamlet on the New York side of Lake Champlain. Amtrak had just opened a seasonal station for vacationers going across the lake to Vermont. The Adirondack, as the train was known, went from New York City to Montreal in 11 hours. Jerry stopped and picked up a train schedule, curious about the towns along the route, and saw that Rouse's Point was a few stops north of Port Kent. It was at Rouse's Point where Jerry had crossed the border into Canada a decade earlier, excited about beginning his odyssey of hope. Esperance, he said aloud in a self-mocking tone. Christina, do I want to stop at this point for anything, or should we keep going? I guess we'll...
You want to keep going maybe for a little bit?
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Well, we're going to skip ahead to when Jerry arrives at the Thimble Islands. He gets a tip about the missing father at some motel nearby, and he learns when he gets there that a severed finger is washed ashore from one of the islands, and the blonde that was seen with the father has disappeared. He's gaining a little confidence now, and he heads to a dingy motel on the outskirts of New Haven, where the father, the missing man, apparently stayed one night. Jerry drove over to the Brightwood Motel on his way to New Haven and sat in his car in front of a cabin with a cleaning cart parked in front. When the maid came out, he quickly approached her and pulled out the picture of Ellis Hoole. Ellis Hoole is the missing man. Remember him? I'm a friend of the family. He's gone missing and they're terribly concerned, he said in his most sympathetic voice. She was wearing a front and back pullover apron, a drab gray shirt, and stained gray sweatpants. The gloomy expression on her face matched her outfit. Her hair was in a net, and Jerry could see an unsightly mishmash of mossy green strands mixed in with dirty brown locks. not the kind of nest anybody would attempt to run their fingers through. A Virginia Slim cigarette was hanging precariously from her mouth, forcing Jerry to suppress a chuckle. He had seen the magazine ads and commercials for the cigarette, depicting beautiful, stylish, professional women on the go. If anything, the maid was a parody of the image the manufacturer was trying to portray. He wondered from which cabin she had lifted the cigarettes. The maid stood mute and stared out of slit eyes until Jerry pulled a $5 bill out of his pocket and dangled it in front of her. "Did you see him at all? Did anyone visit his room?" Jerry asked softly. The maid stared at the money and her eyes opened up a little wider. Even the Virginia Slim perked up. "I didn't see nobody come or go. Just caught a glimpse of him once. After he checked out, I found a hairbrush that he left in the room. I took it, but will call you a goddamn lying bastard if you repeat it. Now can I have the fin?" Her voice was raspy and low as she reached out and grabbed the end of the bill. Jerry smiled and let it go. "As I said, you ain't getting the hairbrush. It doesn't exist if you catch my drift. But I do got something else that might interest you." The maid went to her cart and came back with a book. "You can have it for $2 more. Found it under the bed," she explained, dangling it out in front of her. It was The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. Jerry had read The Pit and the Pendulum and The Murder in the Rue Morgue in junior high school, but never heard of this story. He knew it could be a con, but for $2 he was willing to take a chance. Poe was worth at least that much. So now we've got Edgar Allan Poe into the story. Okay. Jerry is now hooked up. You got to find my place here. Sorry about that. Jerry's now hooked up with his new unofficial partner, Cyrus Trowbridge. He's the retired lawyer, probably about 80 years old. And they're an unlikely couple, and they don't really think of themselves as partners, but they start working together. And Cyrus is starting to guide Jerry around the Thimble Islands and places he can go. And Jerry decides that it's time to interview the missing man's partner out on Quarry Island. Quarry Island does not exist, but I do have an island in mind. Cyrus says he's a dangerous man and you can't go out there alone. It could be tricky navigating the waters around the Thimbles, so Cyrus had arranged for a skilled waterman to captain a skiff for the short ride to Quarry Island. As they approached the shore, Jerry gazed up at the imposing rock formations and marveled at the history behind them. Millions of years ago, these stone walls were formed out of volcanoes that never erupted, and here they were staring down at him. He thought of his trip across upstate New York with stops at Howe's Cavern and Saratoga Springs. Here was another reminder they didn't have to go to Nepal to study the wonders of history. As the boat was being tied up, Elwyn Grex lumbered down to meet his guest. Cyrus had pegged him correctly. He was a tall man with an immense girth. At the belt line, his stomach protruded from beneath a faded and stained black Judas Priest t-shirt with a ferocious fire-spewing dragon across the front. His face was greasy and flushed with a 2 or 3 day growth of beard. His head looked like a speckled pumpkin ready to explode. A few scattered tufts of black hair dotted his shiny scalp. Jerry thought he might be Kevin off of Bender when he noticed the can of Falstaff beer in his hand. "The hair of the dog," Jerry said to himself. He'd been there a few times. "I'm pretty damn busy here, Trowbridge. What's the urgency? Who's this cream puff? Your bodyguard?" Rex asked with a menacing grin. He was above them on an incline, glaring down at Jerry as if itching for a fight. Grex took a slug of beer and wiped his mouth with a meaty paw, waiting for one of them to react. Jerry seized the moment and walked up next to Grex so that they were on an even keel. "I see you're a man of Falstaffian proportions without the roguish wit and the charm of Sir John," Jerry said calmly while pointing to the beer can. "What in Sam Hill you talking about? Hey, you cracking wise with me, knucklehead?" Greg says fiercely, flushed and confused. He inspected the beer can for a clue as to what Jerry meant. He felt that he had been insulted but didn't know how, and it infuriated him. Grex had never backed down from a chance to brawl and had the scars to prove it. With Cyrus there, he showed rare good judgment and decided it wasn't worth it to pummel this outsized kid with a witness only a few feet away. So that's Elwyn Grex, the missing man's partner. Not the kind of person you're going to get warm with, probably not going to have a beer with him. Falstaff beer was a very popular beer back then, by the way. Okay. Jerry has finished reading The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe and thinks there could be a conspiracy surrounding the missing man. Was it his finger that washed ashore? Was he actually murdered? Speculation about maybe the body parts are in Long Island Sound. The police are now investigating, and believe it or not, Grex is their main suspect. And Jerry and Cyrus Trowbridge are kind of advised to back off. This is an official investigation now, and you amateurs need to get out of the way. Jerry's getting a little antsy. There's nothing to do. He's thinking about going home to Parlor City. He then gets a tip that the blonde, the missing blonde that had supposedly vanished, was seen around Union Station in New Haven and had some sort of a run-in with a hobo or transient. And with nothing else to do, Jerry says, I'll hop in the car and head to New Haven. What's the best place to find information? The local saloon. Jerry found the Belly Up bar only 2 blocks from Union Station. As he walked in, he was reminded of the 2 infamous joints back in Parlor City, Craters and Devil's Corner. They were demolished or boarded up before he was old enough to imbibe, but he remembered the stories of mayhem and despair surrounding those 2 notorious saloons. They had contributed to the ruin of many a local family. Belly Up was a tired, blue-collar dive bar with no pretensions, catering to workers in and around Union Station, including train crews coming off their shifts. The red beer signs in the soot-covered windows were flickering when Jerry pushed open the door. There was a pinball machine in one corner flashing lights, and the Wurlitzer jukebox a few feet away was blasting a twangy country song. The singer was debating the relative value of his girlfriend and his dog. Jerry wasn't sure, but it sounded like the canine carried the day. A large Schlitz beer sign hung behind the bar, shaped like a globe with deep blue seas. It was surrounded by ornate gold leafing, inviting the patrons to a world unknown to them and beyond their reach. The bartender, a middle-aged guy with furtive eyes and slick-back gray hair, had a grimy bar towel flung over his shoulder. He pushed a mug of draft beer down the bar to Jerry before turning back to the small television mounted precariously on the wall. The $20,000 pyramid was making the studio audience manic, but the bartender just shook his head desultorily. Jerry took a gulp and announced that he was doing a sociology paper on transient populations in various cities. Finding them is the easy part, the bartender said, eyeing Jerry languidly and pointing over his shoulder toward the train tracks. Getting them to talk to someone like you is a challenge. I wouldn't go down there without a gun or a baseball bat myself, he cautioned, holding up a Louisville Slugger that had been hidden below the bar. You'll find a bunch of them across the tracks. Been there for as long as I can remember. Some hop on afraid and move on. Others hang on here and die off. Once in a while, one will stagger in the door and stagger out when I introduce them to my friend. It's a Johnny Bench signature. I'm from Cincy, he said, tapping the bat and grinning for the first time. Jerry had his opening and grabbed it. I read somewhere that a guy fell on the train tracks a few days ago and died. You don't think foul play was involved, do you? I mean, with the transients? You must be thinking of a guy they call Twitchy, the bartender said. Used to hang out at Pudge McFadden's and do some stupid Steve Martin routine. Nah, they wouldn't have pushed him on the tracks without first stripping off all of his clothes, especially that cream-colored suit of his. Unless one of them went bananas, of course. Listen, these guys live for T-Bird. Got to be pushing 20% alcohol content. They say it causes temporary insanity and violent behavior. If you've ever been on Skid Row in any city, you would know what I mean. You lost me with T-Bird, Jerry said. The bartender was taken aback, almost as if he was offended by Jerry's naivete. It's known as the American classic, young man, like the car. I've been told it came out the same year that Ford introduced the T-Bird, so the makers piggybacked on the car's popularity. It's known as the bum wine for the hobo, the transient, the vagrant, whatever you call them. It's the beverage of choice for many of them. They have nicknames for it, like Pluck, Thunder Chicken, or just plain the Bird. The more sophisticated refer to it as brown bag vino. Haven't you heard the phrase, "What's the word?" Jerry looked lost and the bartender laughed and went on. His eyes were bright now and he was having a good time. You shout out that phrase in some low-rent area with a liquor store nearby and you'll most likely hear Thunderbird shouted back at you and not even know where it came from. That country singer, Billy Joe Shaver, recorded a song last year with the same title. Commercials all over the radio. You've been living in a cave for the last 10 years? Sort of. Time for a little romance. I've got a couple of my daughters with me, so I'm pretty sure that this passage is going to be safe. But I'll find out afterwards if I'm not. Cyrus Trowbridge is an elderly man, as I mentioned earlier. He goes to bed early at night. He's not hanging around. Jerry's getting a little antsy. He's getting tired of the motel. He's staying at a place called the Thimble Inn. And he decides to head over to the Graniteville Saloon one night. And he's spotted by one Fanny Tulk, the constable's niece. She invites him over to her table with her brother and suggests that he help them polish off a pitcher of beer. Now, Jerry had seen Fanny once before, but really hadn't paid attention to her until now. Jerry looked at her more closely than he had during brief encounters at the constable's office. She had a pleasant round face with a pure complexion that revealed a smattering of faded freckles, all set off by saucer-like blue eyes. Her lower lip was full and gave her a slightly pouty expression no matter what her mood. Her pale brown tawny hair was pulled tight in a ponytail, and she was wearing a sleeveless white top with a V-cut that showed off the smooth tan skin of her sleek neck and arms. Jerry was titillated. He had heard guys say almost brag for some reason they were boob or leg men, but Jerry was invariably drawn to the exposed neck. She turned her head slowly, and Jerry decided that it was definitely a neck worth kissing. "How much longer will we be in town?" she asked almost coyly. If it came off like a come-on, it wasn't meant that way, but it made her brother stand up and frown. "I'm walking home now. Mork and Minnie comes on in about 30 minutes, he grumbled. Fanny looked at her brother, then at Jerry, and said, "I'll hang here a bit longer. You go on ahead." Deacon Blues came on the jukebox, and she smiled. "I like Steely Dan, too. Maybe I'd better get another pitcher," Jerry said. "Excellent idea," she responded. "The Alien and the Earth Girl would have to wait." I could go on about the two incipient lovers fumbling their way into the Thimble Inn, but you get the idea. And I do have a couple of daughters here, so. There is a little romance going on, but we'll skip over the carnal delights. Okay, we're just about at the end. I got two more readings. I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep so far. I've skipped over a lot of the stuff that will give away some of the surprise ending. But we're at the point now where Jerry and Cyrus Trowbridge really are starting to like each other. And they know that they're partners, but they're reticent about talking about these things. And so Cyrus decides that they ought to both put this investigation aside. The state police have still not got Grex to confess. They don't have a body yet, and no one can find the mysterious blonde who vanished. So there's a lot of frustration, and Cyrus said, "I'm taking you out to dinner. Let's forget about everything for one night." Cyrus shrugged and then seemed to brighten up. All that talk about Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth was just that. Idle talk to amuse myself. Hope you didn't think I was going to take off. I'm no Dorian Gray. ready to make a Faustian bargain in a bid for eternal youth. No, I'd just like to roll back the clock to a certain date I have in mind and get another shot at it. That's all. Not too much to ask for, is it? Cyrus said with a self-deprecating laugh. No, it's not, Cyrus. In fact, I know how you feel, Jerry said, gulping noticeably as he choked back the words. Cyrus nodded, caught the discomfort, and said, listen, if you ever want to talk, I'm available. First, I want to confess something. Did some checking on you when you first showed up here and started snooping around. I know you're no deserter, but you did take off for Canada around 10 years ago, so my assumption is you were avoiding the draft. I might have had a problem with it back then, but not any longer. As to your motives as a 21-year-old, it's not my business unless you make it so. Whatever it was that prompted you back then, well, I'd like to think that it was for a heartfelt and noble purpose. And I believe it was, Jerry. As to what you did in those intervening years, it's no business of mine either. You seem like a decent young man trying to find yourself. You're not alone. I'm just glad I got to know you. Cyrus finished and tipped his wineglass to Jerry, who felt moisture forming in the corners of his eyes. It sounded like something his father or Billy Meacham Jr. would have said, and it made him profoundly sad and appreciative at the same time. A slight smile creased Jerry's mouth. He wanted to open up, but something was holding him back at the moment, and Cyrus wasn't one to press. A few nights earlier, Jerry had laid in bed, unable to sleep, thinking about how he had been so persuadable, so malleable, under the tutelage of Professor Eismore. During those summers between classes at Pythian, Eismore had arranged for expeditions to the Great Plains and the Grand Canyon to test Jerry's intellectual process and stamina under real-life conditions, or so he explained. Initially, he met the professor's expectations before everything collapsed in Kathmandu. Crippled since childhood by a bout of polio, Eismore would experience vicariously through Jerry and other acolytes the adventures he had missed. If they screwed up, like Jerry had, it was Eismore's torment. It had taken years for Jerry to consider the possibility that he had been used as a tool by the revered professor into an attempt to expunge a lifetime of his own frustrated expectations. Sitting across from Cyrus was revelatory for Jerry. He had earned the affection, if not the respect, of a man he had grown to admire, a man who still struggled with his own self-doubts after all these years. That was what I considered the bonding moment, the two unlikely people. And now we're going to finish up, if I can, with each of my novels has an epilogue where I try to do my best to tie up the loose ends. And if things weren't completed in the novel, if there was some unfinished business, I take care of it there. So the mystery has been solved. In fact, there's more than one mystery solved at the end. And the amateur sleuths were actually instrumental in helping the state police solve the case. Jerry Kaczynski goes south to the Poe Museum and also visits the author's grave in Baltimore. Now he's back in Grenfell, trying to decide what to do next, and he's staring out on the Thimble Islands. Jerry had looked forward to sharing his trip to Poe's museum and gravesite with Cyrus, but would now have to content himself with imagining how his old friend would have reacted. For some reason, it made Jerry think of Augie March. He had started reading the Bellow novel again, after his return from Baltimore, and came upon a passage where an old acquaintance ran into Augie and learns that he's stealing books and selling them to students and collectors. He looks at Augie with a combination of amazement and disappointment before asking him, "What are you postponing everything for?" It sounded like something Cyrus might have said to him. And that is it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm a little dry. I'm going to take a little water and maybe give you some chance to ask some questions. But I had fun, and I hope you did too as well. Thank you. Thank you. I saw that. And by the way, if you want to find out more about me, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. Of course, I'm on Facebook. I also have a Facebook authors page. The normal page is Arno Zimmer. The author page is Arno B. Zimmer. Where else am I? Instagram, did I say that? Instagram, yes. And I post a lot of things there, and I post some videos. And you might have seen me with my friend, my alter ego, the guy that wears the Breaking Bad hat with the sunglasses and the trench coat. Yeah, he helps me out with my promotions once in a while. So anyway.
You want the lowdown, call me. I'm his brother. Or his sister. She knows all the routines too, the truth about Arno Zimmer.
Uh-oh. I would like to say one thing. I know there's going to be some questions, but someone actually in the town of Fairfield asked me out for coffee, and he wanted to ask me about the author and the narrator. And I explained to him that when you write a novel, obviously you're the author, your name's on the cover, but you create a narrator. And the narrator and the author are not the same. Now, usually in writing novels, the reader considers the narrator omniscient. If the narrator says something, you tend to believe the narrator is giving you a fair scoop. But the narrator isn't always omniscient, and you have to make a judgment as a reader whether you trust the narrator. You're going to get what the characters say, and you can make your judgments there, but then you'll notice that as a narrator, the narrator, not me, but that narrator is making comments during the novel, and they're making observations which you may or may not agree with. So they're definitely separate and distinct. And I'm the author, but I'm not the narrator of the novels. So
there's a couple comments. Kay said, "Thank you, Arno. I've enjoyed your work. It's great to hear you read." Someone else said, "Wonderful job, Arno." And then there was a question that said, "Has it been determined if the finger belongs to male or female?" I don't know if that.
Yes, that.
Spoiler.
Yes. Well, who's the macabre person in the audience there? That's great. Yes. A lot happens after that finger comes ashore, and there's a lot of speculation as to who it belongs to, and everybody initially wants to believe it's from the missing man. And so what happens is, in the end, some of the other characters that you didn't hear about today are involved in the mystery, and it turns out that it is a male finger. Okay. And if that's a clue that the mystery blonde wasn't murdered, then you may be off target there as well. But you'll have to read the novel to find that out.
Someone else asked, "Did you get to spend time on the thimbles for research?"
Yes, I did. Obviously, growing up in Binghamton, the Parlor City Trilogy gave me a unique opportunity to go back home, not just to recall my memories, but to go back home, and which I did several times, and walk around the area and go to the library and go to the Historical Society. And you have to do research on the particular area. I'll give you an example. The first novel, The Parlor City Boys, is set in 1955. Return to Parlor City is 1957. A Murder in Parlor Harbor is 1967. Torpedo Factory is 75. Thimble Islands is 77. So we're moving through history here with the characters, and some of the same characters are in all 5 novels, but they have different roles. So I did spend some time at the Thimble Islands. The Stony Creek Museum was very enlightening to me. The Blackstone Library, I've got to give another plug to the library. It's a great facility. But there's so much you can learn about places today right off of your laptop, right? Just by doing research. You really got a library at your disposal. But there's nothing like walking around the place that you're going to make the centerpiece of your novel. I actually had to go up near Lake Ontario to find a village that fit for me for Parlor Harbor, which was the 3rd novel. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah. There was another one. Let's see. Is this book intended to be part of a Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
That's okay. Is this book intended to be part of a future trilogy? There was an incident in my hometown back in the 70s that would be a great starter for a new plot.
I am always open to ideas.
Um,
I'm
Yeah,
actually working on a sixth novel now that doesn't take place anywhere near the Thimble Islands, but I wouldn't mind going back there if I got the proper motivation.
yeah, this was, I grew up in a small town in Jersey,
Uh-huh.
and it was right at the point where, I went to school in New York and everyone was, oh, why are you going to this place that's so dangerous, yada, yada. And then what happened was these pieces of bodies started washing up on the Snake River once a month. That's funny, but a finger, the plot idea really caught my attention and
Right.
could figure out what it was for about a year. And it turns out that an elderly man in the next town had killed his wife and put her in a basement, those freezers. And every once in a while he would take a piece and put it in the river and hoping to eventually, disappear her. But it had a whole 2 or 3 towns in New Jersey very creeped out for a long time.
Has there been any novels written about that incident?
No, not that I know of.
I guess we better
The
talk.
irony was they were so scared about me being in New York when, actually they have this murder taking place in their own midst. But we can talk if you.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Let's see. Thank you. A couple more questions. Someone said, how do you write and how much research?
Right. First of all, I write longhand and I scribble up the side. I scribble on napkins. I find that one of the best ways for me to get rid of writer's block is to take a walk, and things seem to clear up and I can come back home and finish what I could not finish when I left the house. After writing longhand, I usually will fiddle with it for a couple of days, do some more editing of the rough draft, and then the next stage is to type out a rough draft of that chapter. And then I'll go back. I would say I'll go back on a typical chapter 6, 7, 8 times, all up right up to the end. I do a lot of extensive research because in my novels, the historical parts of my novels, I pray that they are correct. The fictitious parts are pretty obvious, but the historical references, for example, the Thimble Islands with the Captain Kidd and the buried treasure, which was all talked about how the islands were formed. I don't know if I mentioned, but there's 365 Thimble Islands, one for every day of the year. Most of them are underwater. Only 20 or so are habitable. But based on whether it's low or high tide, you'll see more or less islands, as the case might be. But it's a very intriguing area. And so I spend a lot of time on the research and try to get the facts right.
Thank you. There's one more. What is your favorite part of the process of writing novels and why?
I think at the final stage, when I'm doing the final editing and I'm starting to feel like I've got all the problems worked out, I'm starting to feel pretty good at that stage. Working with the artist on the cover, thinking about how it's going to put together some sort of a promotion, but that's the fun stage. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. That's all the questions I see for now. So thank you.
Well, anybody can reach out to me on social media. Be glad to respond to anybody. I see a familiar face or two on there, so hello. Glad that some friends and acquaintances from here to St. Louis, maybe even further, were able to join today. Again, thank you very much, and I hope this inaugural reading will lead to some others. I am going to try to post some of this information on social media, And if you could finish up, Christina, isn't there going to be a replay available through the library?
Yep, has all been recorded, so it just has to process, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel, which can be accessed just by going to our website. We have a link to it, to our YouTube channel, and it'll be right on there.
Very good. Okay.
Yep.
Well, thanks again to all the folks at the Blackstone Library. It's been a lot of fun for me, and thank you all for taking the time today. Appreciate it very, very much.
It's been really fun. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.
Thanks, Arno. Thank you, Arno.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arno.
Thank you.
Wow. Wow.
Great. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.
So interesting.
My first author session ever. So,
It's the first time I've ever done it too. I'm gonna check out the library more often because I think they've got something coming up in another month or so that I'm gonna check in on too at the library.
so Rita, I'm going to leave now, but I'll send you a Zoom for later.
Okay. Yep. Good.
Bye-bye.
Arno, great job.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Arno.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Talk to
Thank you,
soon.
Arno.
Yep.
Loved it. Fascinating. Bye.